This is the Retirement Lifestyle Advocates radio program. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Glad you decided to listen in today. Joining me on today's program in segments 2 and 3 is my special guest, Mr. Karl Denninger. Many of you will recognize Karl as a returning guest and a prolific economic, investing, and political commentator at market-ticker.org. Let me remind you that since we are in the month of May, I do have a brand new May special report for you. All you need to do to get your copy of the May special report titled Probate Avoidance Guide is go to the website requestyourreport.com. The website again is requestyourreport.com. When you go to that website and let me know where to mail the report, I'll not only mail you the probate avoidance guide, I'll also send you a copy of my best-selling revenue sourcing book that has been updated for 2024. And I'll also send you a copy of the Little Black Book on Social Security Maximization. It's a box of free stuff, including the May special report. Again, go to requestyourreport.com and let me know where to mail that, and I'll be very glad to do so. You know, for a very long time, I've been talking about the fact that I believe we are headed for a stagflationary environment. Stagflation, I would define as continuing or accelerating consumer price inflation, meaning the prices we pay for everything will continue to go up, along with a contracting economy. Now, we are starting to see signs that this forecast is coming to fruition. Commercial real estate is one area that we're starting to see things break down a bit. The Daily Mail, a UK publication, reported recently, just last week, in fact, that commercial real estate foreclosures are up. During the month of March, they were up 6% from February. And get this, commercial real estate foreclosures up 117% from the same time in 2023. In other words, up 117% from March of 2023. Now, we've already heard of some recent banking failures once again, or a recent banking failure again. I believe that this will probably lead to more banking issues that will have to be addressed. Now, the Daily Mail article pointed out and brought to light a rather alarming statistic when it comes to commercial real estate. Nearly $1 trillion in commercial real estate loans is maturing yet this year. We're sitting here in May, so to loosely calculate the math, in the next 8 months, there's $1 trillion in commercial real estate loans that will mature and will need to be refinanced. Now, to keep in mind that commercial real estate loans are financed for a short period of time, unlike a home mortgage, what you find is that payments on this real estate will likely be a lot higher to the owners, given that interest rates are a lot higher. So let me give you an example. Let's say that there was a commercial real estate loan put in place 4 years ago. Let's say it was originated in March of 2020. I did some homework and I found that the prime interest rate in March of 2020 was 3.25%. Now let's say that office building owner has to refinance their commercial real estate loan at prime rate today. It's now 8.5%. So in just 4 years, the prime interest rate went up 5.25%. Now, to be fair, the majority of commercial real estate loans are not financed at prime. It's typically prime plus a percentage, but I'll just use prime interest as an example. If we amortize a $10 million office building loan at 3.25% interest for a period of 25 years, and that's typically how commercial loans are amortized, we have a monthly principal and interest debt service payment of just about $49,000 a month. Now, let's take that same $10 million office building, and let's say that now that loan is refinancing at 8.5% for the same 25-year period. We now have a monthly principal and interest debt service payment of about $81,000 a month. The payment goes from $49,000 a month to $81,000 a month. By math, the payment went up $32,000 per month on the same building of the same value, yet the payment went up 65.2%. Now, what does that mean? Well, roughly speaking, rents would need to increase that same percentage to keep cash flows constant, but that is not what's going on in this sector. Think about this for a minute. Imagine that you are a tenant in a commercial real estate space. If your rent is $10,000 a month for your space, what will your reaction be when your landlord tells you that if you want to keep your space, you're going to increase your monthly rent outlay from $10,000 a month to $16,500 a month? Doesn't that little example that I just walked through, explain the sudden spike in real estate foreclosures, particularly as inflation is consuming more discretionary income by the day? And that is true of both consumers and it's true of businesses. Now, Gallup recently conducted a poll about inflation. I'm going to get to that in just a minute, but before I do, let me remind you that the May special report, the probate avoidance guide, as well as all the free information that accompanies it, is available for you just by visiting requestyourreport.com. Requestyourreport.com. When you visit that website and let me know where to mail that report, I'll be very glad to do so. Now, despite the fact that many of us still remember a lot of politicians and policymakers that I won't mention by name today, a lot of these folks told us that inflation would be transitory. Well, that obviously was not true. Instead, inflation has become a stubborn, accelerating financial obstacle unlike anything we've seen for decades. And a Gallup poll that was conducted recently confirms this rather sobering fact. This is from the Gallup organization, and I will quote, "For the third year in a row, the percentage of Americans naming inflation or the high cost of living as the most important financial problem facing their family has reached a new high. The 41% naming inflation as the most important financial problem is the highest ever, and up 35% from a year ago and 32% in 2022. Before 2022, the highest percentage seen in this same poll mentioning inflation as the number one financial obstacle was 18%, and that was all the way back in 2008 during the financial crisis. So there's 28% more, nearly 3 in 10 people more saying today inflation is their number one financial problem. Now, Gallup conducts this economy and personal finance poll every year during the month of April. This particular poll was conducted April 1 through April 22. And because inflation is the number one obstacle for 41% of the population, do you think that might explain why we have such record high credit card debt at the time? I've talked about this before, but it fits in with this particular topic. Total credit card debt is now $1.34 trillion. $1.34 trillion is now being carried on credit cards. Now, if we go back 3 years ago, this number was not even at $1 trillion. It's now approaching $1.4 trillion, up 35 to 40%. Credit card debt presently, Total outstanding credit card debt is now about equal to the annual outlay for Social Security. And that is mind-blowing when you think about it. There are more than 72 million Social Security beneficiaries. Bankrate tells us the average monthly benefit from Social Security is about $1,700. So think about 72 million people receiving an average Social Security benefit of $1,700 a month for a year. If you could somehow stack up all that money in one place, it would approximately equal the total debt outstanding on credit cards. Do you have that mental image? Do you have that picture in mind? If you do, now ask yourself if you think that level of debt can ever be paid. The question answers itself, and the day of reckoning or default is coming, which is why I believe we'll see more bank failures like the one we just saw in Pennsylvania from Republic First. I'm coming up on a break here, and again, if you're just tuning in, joining me after the break will be Mr. Karl Denninger. He's a commentator at market-ticker.org. But before I go to break, let me remind you that if you have not yet received the May special report, the Probate Avoidance Guide, just go to requestyourreport.com and I'll be glad to send it to you, along with all the bonus information. I'll be back after these words. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Joining me once again on today's program is returning guest, Mr. Karl Denninger. Karl is a prolific commentator and writer. You can read his work at market-ticker.org. The website, again, is market-ticker.org. There are multiple sections on that site, and I'd encourage you to check them all out. Karl, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me, Dennis.
So, Karl, you recently had, I thought, was a really interesting take, a great perspective on this really healthy jobs report that came out. Can you fill the listeners in? Or this allegedly healthy jobs report, should I say that?
Yeah, I think we should say allegedly healthy. Last month's report was approximately in line with what you'd expect to see for that month. Okay, I mean, it wasn't. March is usually a hiring month. I do not look at the knob-twisted establishment survey that they put their little black box stuff to. I look at the unadjusted household survey, which is an actual survey, as the name implies. And the reason I use unadjusted is because Christmas happens at the same time every year, right? So if I look at Christmas this year versus Christmas last year, well, December versus December, I'm going to have a pretty accurate picture of what's going on. What I saw there was the same thing we've seen for the last few years, which is a huge amount of ads in healthcare. But these are not doctors and nurses. These are all people that are essentially in the business of extracting money from you. And so, they're all administrative to some extent. Right? I'm sure some of them are janitors. Somebody's got to sweep the floor, right? But they aren't doctors and nurses, and we know that because that's there's separate surveys on how many doctors and nurses have entered versus left the workforce. And this is a pattern that's been going on for a long time. The other place that you have is in government, which of course is the same sort of thing. I mean, what do they actually do, right? Other than find ways to spend the money. And if you think about it, 72,000 jobs supposedly last month added in healthcare. You think about this, you really think that we needed to add someone in that part of the economy for every 4,600 people in America? Because that's what the number is. Okay, now that's not we need a doctor for every 4,600 people. That's we need another person in healthcare for every 4,600 on top of what's already there. I don't believe that for a minute. And if you look at the parts of the economy that actually make things that you want to consume and that you do consume, mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, transportation, warehousing, that sort of stuff, their employment was flat. It was basically nothing, no change. So in the areas of the economy that actually benefit everybody, it was a zero. It wasn't a negative number. That's the good news. but it wasn't a positive one either. And in the areas that add cost to your living, just add expense and not betterment, it went up substantially. Well, isn't that what we've seen over the last few years? Is that's where all the costs, are, I mean, what is inflation, right? It's pay more, get less. Well, there you are. The other thing that I find rather interesting is that we have asset markets that all think that putting 300,000 jobs into the economy in a month means that there's imminently going to be rate cuts. Well, excuse me, the neutral employment gain rate is about 200. So we're 50% over that, and people think rates are coming down? I don't think so. Never mind that all the places that people are being hired are in places that cause inflation in your life. Maybe not in price necessarily, but in terms of expenses you have to have in order to keep on your feet. I don't see any way that this report supports the idea that there are rate cuts coming anytime this year. I don't see anything in support of that at all. And in fact, Cash Carey came out shortly after that and basically said, yeah, I don't see it.
So, Karl, you think the Fed's just going to stand pat this year, even though we're looking at an election year, even though we might have an election year goodie bag, to use that term, passed? You think the Fed probably just holds pat?
Well, I think if anything, if the Fed does anything, I think they're going to raise rates. I think they're going to have to. And the goodie bag thing, if that was to occur, would tend to force that outcome. The Fed has a loosely stated policy that they've more or less followed, except in extreme cases like in 2008 when there was an ongoing crash right into the maw of the election, right? Other than at that time, once you get to about June or July, they tend to stay out of the game. And if they can, they'd prefer to, because they certainly, anybody that thinks that they don't have a political element to what they do is, I think, a little crazy. But they certainly don't want to appear to be overtly attempting to either help or damage one candidate or another.
So, Karl, where is this economy headed? Before we started recording, you I thought made some interesting observations about the yield curve and really how unprecedented the length of time we've had an inverted yield curve is. Can you comment a little bit about that? What does that mean historically, and just kind of share with the listeners what we chatted about?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you take a look at the 10-year and the 13-week T-bill. It's the 10 years of TNX, the 13-week T-bill is the IRX. Those are really easy for anybody to get at that has a trading console of any kind if you're a retail trader. That ratio inverted. It went negative in October of 22. Okay, so that's been over a year now. We're a year and a half into this. That doesn't happen. Okay, now most people are aware that when the yield curve's inverted, it is signaling a recession. And the reason is that people are expecting that it will be cheaper to borrow in the future than it is to borrow today. That's all it really tells you. But the yelling that has been going on for the last year and change is that somehow a 5% short-term interest rate is unreasonable. It's extremely restrictive. It needs to come down. It's damaging the economy. It's this and that's that. And that's just nonsense. If you have a 2% inflation rate and about a 3% gain in productivity, which is 3% is about the historical average on that over long periods of time, assuming that you want to borrow money for a short period of time, so there's no time value involved, the expected rate would be about 5 if there's no risk. And since I'm 60, I'd love to have 20 years of my life back. I can never get them, of course. Time always has value. So the idea that you would pay less to borrow for 10 years than you would pay to borrow for 13 weeks is nuts. Okay. So that's the reason the signal means something to people in the markets. But the concept that somehow, assuming we had 2% inflation, and we don't, it's much higher. It's, I mean, by the government's numbers, it's 3.5 to 4. By anybody who's had to renew their homeowners or car insurance, it's 20.
Right.
Uh,
It's crazy.
right. I mean, if you look at things from a realistic operating perspective, why would I loan you money for 5% if I'm going to have if I'm going to see 20% of the value of my money destroyed? All right, that would be crazy. I'd be on my mind to do that. So I don't see any way for that to change, and that inflation is coming directly from government deficit spending. So right now, the government is running about a 30% fiscal deficit. So they're spending a third more approximately than what they take in taxes. That's what has been driving the inflationary impulse that has gone on over all these years. And we reset that percentage considerably higher when COVID started, and it's never come back down, even though supposedly the pandemic's over. So the markets are correctly perceiving that that ain't reality, except you've got people in the stock market that are absolutely convinced, and in the real estate markets that are absolutely convinced that the doubling or more of house prices that took place over that 3-4 year period is a new normal, and it's fine, and rates are not going to stay at 7%, and you should buy a house and wait a year and refinance. If you think that's going to work out for you, I'll see you in the bankruptcy court line. I think that's exactly where you're headed.
So, Karl, just since the first of the year, we've seen interest rates on the 10-year U.S. Treasury rise, and it just seems that in this environment that's going to have to be the trend. Would you agree?
Yeah, I don't see any way that you see that change until Congress changes its pattern, and there's no evidence at the present time from either political party. And no matter who wins, and this is, people that think that there's some kind of a put in essentially being put out there, and in the outcome of the election, and that, well, if it goes one way, this is going to happen. It goes the other. From a fiscal point of view, there's no evidence that either party is going to do anything. I mean, we have a Republican House, we have a Democrat Senate, we have a Democrat president. Even if the Republicans were to sweep all of the three in November, Trump gets reelected and the House and the Senate both go red. I don't, and I see the Senate as going red as a fairly high probability, simply because the numerics favor the Republicans in this particular 2 year cycle of the six. But even if that was to happen, you would get a clean sweep. I don't see anything that's going to slow down the spending pulse, and that's where the problem is. So until that changes, I don't understand how a president or a set of Congress people or whatever yelling at the Federal Reserve is going to do anything, because if they drop rates into that environment, inflation is going to explode.
Well, I'm chatting to Mr. Karl Denninger. His website is market-ticker.org. I'd encourage you to check it out. The website again, market-ticker.org. I'll continue my conversation with Karl when RLA Radio returns. Stay with us. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Joining me on today's program is returning guest, Mr. Karl Denninger. I've been chatting with Karl about what's going on in the economy, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this segment. If you're just joining us, I'd encourage you to check out Karl's blog at market-ticker.org. Market-ticker.org. Karl is a prolific commentator. Always appreciate his perspective. And Karl, let's kind of pick it up where we left off. You mentioned that government spending is the problem. Government spending is what's fueling inflation. And certainly when you take a look at how consumers are reacting, there's a couple stats I noticed. The big one being that credit card debt is now pushing $1.4 trillion. And the other stat is that personal savings is now near about a 15-year low. Those statistics tell us that inflation's kind of taking its toll, doesn't it?
Yeah, you have to be a little careful with personal savings rate. That's a number that a lot of people in the media love to trumpet one way or another. The economists in D.C. define personal savings a little bit differently than you and I do. You probably think of personal savings as how much money you stick in the bank every month after you pay all your bills, or in the stock market, or whatever you do with it. But money that doesn't get spent. That's how most of us think of personal savings. That's not how they define it. If you pay debt down, that counts as savings. So when when you make payments on your car, okay, I mean, you really can't make this stuff up, okay? But it's income minus personal consumption expenditures is the definition. So that's a little odd. Um, but yeah, there's the credit card outstanding balances are particularly troubling. A lot of people don't seem to have a very long memory because both in 2000 and 2008, when we had both of those financial events occur, credit card issuers went around and started slamming balances down to the outstanding amount in terms of your credit line. At any hint of financial instability, they were doing that. And they will do it again. They have the right to do it in your card agreement, and they will do it. And if you are needing to use your card to finance your daily expenditures, you're going to get a rude surprise when you go to the grocery store and the card comes back declined. And they don't necessarily give you much in the way of notice when they do it either. The other thing that is, and by the way, that gets really ugly if they start ratcheting it down every time you make a payment, which they've also been known to do. The other thing that's interesting, and I saw this in 2008, and it's 1 month so far, so I'm always a little careful with 1 month changes because a trend is not made in a month. But that is last time around when we were all being glad-handed and told that subprime was contained and there wasn't going to be any kind of a serious problem. There was a fairly significant and statistically important re-rating that happened within the credit agencies. FICO scores for an awful lot of people that hadn't had any change in their financial situation at all, spending patterns, income, whatever have you, all of a sudden 30, 40 points disappeared. 20, sometimes 20, 30, 40. Now, for somebody that has an 810 or an 820, having 20 points disappear doesn't change anything for you. You're still considered an exceptional credit risk. That doesn't mean anything. It's not going to result in any adverse consequences on your insurance costs or anything like this. But for somebody that has a 650, that 20 points is the difference between having something that is going on and not. Okay. I mean, that's a very serious problem for people in the lower economic strata. And I'm starting to see some evidence of that. It's not everywhere, but, and like I said, it's 1 month so far. But if that gets confirmed over the next couple of months, I'm going to get very concerned.
Well, Karl, doesn't it make sense that banks obviously they tend to when there's loose money policies, they tend to go too far, and then as always happens, the pendulum swings too far one way, and then it swings back too far the other way. Don't you expect in this environment that we're going to see more banking failures, and you're going to see a pretty significant credit contraction across the board? Maybe not even just credit cards.
Well, yeah. I mean, the other place that I think you're going to see some really serious problems is in autos. And the insurance problem that people are running into right now, and it's everywhere. I mean, I have no claims, I have no tickets. And as it turns out, it looks like I'm about average, seeing about a 20% increase. Okay, that's oh boy, is that nuts, right? I mean, these are 6 month premiums. Who knows what next 6 months will be? But they've been very stable for quite a while now. All of a sudden, it's up 20%. And I haven't changed vehicles or anything. Now I know what's driving it in some of the newer cars. A headlight is $2,000. Okay, whereas a headlight for one of my vehicles is the plastic housing's $50. Right? So that's part of the problem, is that we've got all these doodads and this fancy stuff on these newer vehicles. They get damaged in relatively small collisions. that really aren't otherwise a big thing. But all of a sudden, this fender bender that would cost you a few $100s to have the bumper cover, taken off and repainted and put back together. All of a sudden, it's $2,500 because one of your headlights got smashed, and that's what it costs to buy another one. And so that kind of thing is ridiculously driving up claim rates. And of course, the insurance company has to respond to that. And then they loved the housing price ramps. They don't love so much when their homeowners insurance goes up by 25% because, hey, guess what? If your house burns to the ground, well, the loss is now larger than it would have otherwise been because you have to rebuild, and the building materials went up in price too. So did the labor.
Yeah, and
So I
insurance
think,
costs have been going up across the board, and then of course you look at California, where what is it, Proposition 103 or something that capped rates, and now insurers are just pulling out of the state. So there's a lot of layers to that onion.
yeah, well, there's part of the problem you have is just due to the human condition, all right? People love to live in places that that are beautiful and whatever. Well, they also happen to have higher risk. And the way that we used to deal with this when insurance was not so easily available and cheap and distorted by low rates was that if you wanted to have a house on the beach in Florida, it was probably a cinder block thing with some low value furniture and stuff like that in there. And a hurricane came and it got flooded. Well, you threw everything out. You got the pressure washer out. You cleaned it out, and life goes on. If it got completely destroyed, well, you were out 50 grand. I mean, the foundation's still, slab's still there. You put up some more blocks and put another, roof on it. But then we turned around and we took these places and refinished them into, palatial looking joints that sell for $1 million. And all of a sudden, that's not really an option. Now people want insurance on that. But the fact of the matter is that the storm is still going to come whenever it decides to come. But now instead of having a $100,000 piece of property in the way, there's $1 million piece of property in the way. And at some point, that becomes a problem. And then in those coastal areas, particularly in Florida, is one of the reasons I left the state, is that there's an awful lot of fraud. And all of that ends up reflecting back into everybody's premiums. So you had situations, and I'm personally aware of a few of them where I used to live, where there would be somebody that had a 15-year-old roof on their house. There's a nasty line of thunderstorms or a mild tropical storm or hurricane that comes through. It's nothing major, doesn't really flood anybody, doesn't do a whole lot of damage. All of a sudden they claim that the storm destroyed their roof. And what really destroyed their roof was the 15, 20 years worth of age. Okay. But if they can manage to find some corrupt contractor that will say, oh, yeah, that was storm damage. Well, now it's a claim. And instead of ordinary maintenance. And as a result, that ends up reflecting back into rates. And when it happens too many times, the insurance companies, nobody's going to pay what they want to charge. And so they just say, well, we're done with this. Nobody ever goes to jail for this kind of thing. And so they leave.
So, Karl, we've got just a few minutes left here. I'd like to go back and maybe revisit something we talked about earlier. You mentioned at the end of the first segment that we recorded that really this inflation is driven largely by government deficit spending. How do you see this ultimately ending? Don't we have to have a reset point at some future time? And what does that look like in your opinion?
Well, within the government, within the federal milieu, and it's different. It's somewhat different in the states, but within the federal area, the only place that we can take this on is within the medical system, and that means CMS. It means Medicare and Medicaid. And it either happens or the government and its fiscal stability collapses because the acceleration rate there is utterly obscene. Last fiscal year, it was over $2 trillion. It was roughly a third of the entire federal spend was there. You cannot solve the federal government's fiscal problems without fixing that. And most of that is in one way or another felony level illegal and has been for over 100 years because it violates antitrust law. So we need to have people within the government that are willing to stand up and say, okay, if you do this stuff, you're going to jail. We mean it. We're not fooling around. The problem is neither party wants to do that because obviously, if you get ads run against you that you're going to throw granny down the stairs and stuff like this. But that is the only way you're going to see this problem resolved. And I am quite skeptical that we have the wherewithal within our government apparatus and our people to go ahead and get this done. But it needs to happen. And if it doesn't, then it continues onward with 1 in 5 people in the economy working in this area. Most of them are not actually helping people; they're just shuffling money around. And eventually, the government runs out of the ability to pay for it, and you either see an inflationary spiral that forces the Fed to put rates at Volcker levels, and then Congress has to stop because they can't fund it. Okay, the Treasury auctions, they just can't pay the interest. Or the other alternative is that the federal government literally collapses.
So, Karl, how far down the road? I know this is a difficult question to answer, but from a timing perspective, can we see this continue, business as usual for another 10 years? Or do you think that we're going to have a come to Jesus moment, to use that term, before then?
No, I don't think it goes another 2 years. I would be surprised if we don't see a market reaction, a recognition that this is not going to play out the way people are believing that it will this year in the equity markets and in housing, and whether or not that draws the kind of reaction that we got when COVID hit, where the government tries to spend even more, which it might, or whether we have our esteemed Fed chair walk into the Speaker of the Houses and Schumer's offices and say, "Look, guys, bottom line is this: you either cut this out, or you're going to see rates ratchet higher, whether I want them to or not." Because the truth is that the Fed doesn't set rates; it follows the market. If you look at the 13-week bill and the Fed funds rate, the 13-week bill moves first. So if you believe that the Federal Reserve is actually setting rates, you're wrong. And Congress and the public, boy, that's a good boogeyman. That way you can point your finger at them. But that's not where the issue is. And if this does not get addressed, the market is going to eventually say, all right, that's enough of this. And that's when it ends.
Well, my guest today has been Mr. Karl Denninger. His blog you can read at market-ticker.org. The website, again, is market-ticker.org. Karl, always get terrific feedback when you're on the program. Thanks for joining us today. Love to have you back down the road.
Anytime. Thank you very much.
We will return after these words. You are listening to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Glad you decided to listen in today. And thanks again to my special guest on today's program, Mr. Karl Denninger. If you've not yet requested the May special report, it is the Probate Avoidance Guide. You can get this report by visiting the website, requestyourreport.com. The website, again, is requestyourreport.com. Just let me know where to mail the report, and I will be very glad to do so. In the first segment of today's program, I talked about the fact that credit card debt was equal to the outlay of Social Security. Let me be a bit more clear. Total outstanding debt being carried on credit cards by consumers in the United States today is about equal to the annual outlay for Social Security benefits to over 72 million Social Security beneficiaries. That, however, is just credit card debt. When you take a look at credit card debt, it is minuscule in the whole scheme of things. Now, if we look purely at private sector debt, focusing just on household debt, we talked about the fact that credit card debt is about $1.34 trillion. Total household debt, we're at about $21.3 trillion. When you add in business debt and government debt, and when we're talking about government debt, let's add in debt at the federal, state, and local levels, then the debt picture gets very ugly. In fact, you can go to usdebtclock.org, and they keep a running total of this number. Total debt is now more than $100 trillion in the United States. Federal government debt, state government debt, local government debt, business and household debt now has reached $100 trillion. That's about 4 times the total economic output of the United States in a year. Incidentally, 100 trillion is 100 with 12 zeros behind it. Now, there are about 84 million families in the United States. So let's do some relatively simple math. At least it's simple if your calculator has enough zeros. Let's take 100 trillion total debt and divide by the number of families in the United States, just to put this in perspective. Debt per family, $1,190,000, more than almost $1.2 million. Now, USDebtClock.org lists the average savings per family in the United States. I have to tell you, it's not near 1.2 trillion. It's not near the real number of 1,190,000. According to USDebtClock.org, it's $7,767. Does that put it in perspective? Now, if I ask you if that debt will ever completely be paid, the answer becomes obvious. Here's the next really important question to think about. To whom is that debt owed? Well, there's not a single answer, but suffice it to say, a lot of this debt is owed to banks because banks are in the business of lending money. That likely means more bad news for the banking sector moving ahead that has already had its share of bad news recently. Republic First, a Philadelphia-based bank, was seized by regulators last month. Now, Forbes, as well as a number of other media outlets, did report on this, but the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities seized the bank, seized Republic First, following speculation that it would happen. Now, the bank had been looking for a potential buyer, but once the regulators jumped in and seized the bank, Fulton Bank reached an agreement to take over Republic First's 32 branches across Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. So the Republic First branches will reopen under the Fulton Bank name. Now, this problem had been coming for a bit. Republic First was first delisted by NASDAQ in August after the bank failed to file its fiscal year 2022 report with the SEC. Now, not coincidentally, in my view, the Fed's emergency lending program called the Bank Term Funding Program was put in place in March of 2023 to keep the banking system solvent, and that program expired March of 2024, despite the fact that there's about $126 billion still owed to that fund by different banks. Claros Consulting Group recently did an analysis of 4,000 banks and found there are 282 banks that are facing risks from the commercial real estate loan situation that I talked about in the first segment. So we are in for some changes. If you're planning for a traditional retirement, those traditional retirement planning strategies, in my view, may not do what you want them to do. The best thing for you to do is to educate yourself, and that's why I'm offering a free box of information this month. It contains the probate avoidance guide, the revenue sourcing book, as well as a little black book on Social Security maximization. Just go to request your report, and I'll be glad to send you all that info. That's all the time I have for now. I'll be back again next week.